Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Yannick Edmond, and I am with the Office of Minority Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you for joining us for this technical assistance webinar for the Demonstrating Effective Policies to Promote Black Youth Mental Health Funding Opportunity. I am joined today by Ms. Tish Hall, also in the Office of Minority Health, and Mr. Dwayne Barlow, Branch Chief, Grants and Acquisitions Management in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. Next slide. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All participants have been muted. Today, we will provide an overview of the Notice of Funding Opportunity and competitive application requirements as noted on the agenda. We invite you to submit questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. Please ensure that you select the option to send questions to all panelists. We will respond to questions during the Q&A session and in an FAQ document, which will be posted on grants.gov. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on OMH's YouTube channel. Please note that the information provided in this webinar does not supersede any of the content of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. The Notice of Funding Opportunity is the written document that will govern the competition. We strongly encourage you to subscribe to the Notice of Funding Opportunity on grants.gov to ensure that if there are any revisions made to the NOFO, you will receive notice. Now, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Tish Hall. Next slide.
Thank you, Yannick. And I would like to take a moment to share our mission of the Office of Minority Health, which is to serve minority communities by supporting efforts to improve the health of racial and ethnic minority disadvantaged populations through the development of health policies and programs that will help eliminate health disparities. Through demonstration grants, OMH supports the identification of effective approaches for improving health outcomes with the ultimate goal of promoting sustainability and dissemination of these approaches. Next slide, please. This notice solicits applications for projects from eligible public and nonprofit entities to demonstrate the effectiveness of general health and wellness policies in improving Black youth mental health, including suicide prevention. For the purpose of this initiative, Black youth is defined as children ages 10 to 17 years old who are African American or from the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world with African ancestry who are living in the United States. Next slide, please. Again, each award will focus on the populations that include Black youth, as defined as children ages 10 to 17 years old who are African American or from the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world with African ancestry who are living in the United States. Next slide. A total of $3 million is available for up to 8 awards for a project period of up to 3 years. Up to $450,000 shall be awarded per budget period per award recipient. These awards will be grants, and each budget period is contingent upon availability of funds, satisfactory performance, and the best interests of the federal government following a review of a non-competing continuation application. The anticipated start date for the awards is September 15th, 2022. Next slide, please. To achieve the initiative's goals, OMH expects recipients to conduct project activities in the following areas: relationships with communities and institutions, recruit and facilitate a multi-sector advisory council, utilize OMH developed policy assessment framework, policy demonstrations and data collection, develop and implement process, outcomes, and impact evaluation plan, identify and disseminate interventions and lessons learned. Also, develop and implement a process and outcomes evaluation plan, develop and implement a sustainability plan, and develop and implement a disparities impact statement. Next slide, please. Relationships with communities and institutions information can be found on page 9 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. OMH expects recipients to develop and build on strong relationships within communities and institutions, including those that serve Black youth and their families. Recipients must be ready to engage with Black youth and the community-based organizations that serve them in culturally and linguistically appropriate means and mechanisms. Next slide, please. The advisory board expectation can be found on page 9 of the NOFO, where, as it was stated earlier, OMH will provide the organizational structure and operational framework for the Black Youth Mental Health Initiative. OMH expects the award recipients to recruit and facilitate a multi-sector advisory council that will provide expertise and advice to the project, including identification of policy options, assessment of policies, selection of high impact policies, and dissemination of results from policy assessments. The advisory council may involve representatives from public and nonprofit agencies with experience working with Black youth and families. Representation should reflect a broad range of stakeholders as appropriate to the project, which may include health, behavioral health, and education, Title V administering agencies, child care and child welfare, juvenile justice, faith-based organizations, community-based positive youth development organizations, community development entities, including sports and recreation organizations, and individuals with relevant lived experience. Next slide, please. A description of the policy assessment framework and tool can be found on page 10 of the NOFO, and extensive information can be found starting on page 53. You will find that this framework will provide more detail, but it includes 4 phases. 1, policy identification. 2, policy assessment. 3, strategic reform and implementation. And 4, policy evaluation. To develop a BYMH policy assessment framework, the innovation components were paired with foundational policy process phases to produce a comprehensive model designed to capture both intended and unintended impact of current federal, state, and local policies. Next slide, please. OMH expects recipients to implement 1 to 3 innovative and culturally effective policy approaches using an evidence-based model, such as the precede proceed model, which can be found on page 61 of your NOFO. We expect recipients to select 3 separate implementation settings, such as schools, faith-based organizations, community centers, health centers, or other community agencies and settings. Next slide, please. We expect the recipients to develop and implement a process, outcomes, and impact evaluation plan, which will clearly assess 1, the extent to which the implementation of the policy assessment protocol framework identified crossover effect of policies shown to be effective in addressing other health promotion and prevention areas on Black youth mental health, including Black youth at risk for suicide. 2, to the extent to which activities were completed with identified timeframes. Next slide, please. 3, this is a continuation of the steps, to the extent to which the implemented tool resulted in improved adherence to the national standards for culturally and linguistically appropriate services, or CLAS, in health and healthcare. Or you can also find information about national CLAS. So they are classified as two ways to identify national CLAS standards. And then 4, the extent to which the implemented tool resulted in analysis of policies across environmental and ecological factors, such as the following sectors: communication, physical environment, housing, education, and criminal justice. Next slide, please. The dissemination plan. OMH expects the recipient to document and share project findings, including lessons learned, successes and challenges, with the cross-sector stakeholders and other audiences. We ask that you describe the method that will be used to document and disseminate your project's results and findings in a timely manner and in easily understandable format. Describe your target audience, the general public, and other parties who might be interested in using the results of the project. Include the scale and reach of the proposed dissemination. This would include national, regional, or local reach. Also propose any other innovative approaches to informing parties who might be interested in using the results of the project to inform practice, service delivery, program development, and/or policy making, especially to those parties who would be interested in replicating the project. Also, to the extent to which the applicant describes an appropriate and feasible approach for documenting and disseminating the project knowledge and findings to the relevant program. Next slide, please. OMH expects recipients to develop a preliminary plan for sustaining the effective components of this project. Recipients should develop a preliminary sustainability plan within 1 year following the award to be submitted with the non-competing continuation application. We expect the sustainability plan to identify key individuals and/or organizations whose support will be required in order to sustain activities, financial and staff resources needed, and existing collaborative partnerships with organizations that might embed the project within their routine operations or provide other support to sustain the preventive services utilization efforts. Next slide, please. The disparities impact statement can be found on page 11 of the NOFO. The disparities impact statement will be required within the 30 days following the issuance of the award made under this announcement. OMH expects each award recipient to develop a disparities impact statement using local data to identify subpopulations at highest risk for health disparities relative to this initiative. The disparities impact statement refers to the demographic, cultural, and linguistic data that identify the populations in which health disparities exist, and the quality improvement plan designed to address the noted disparities. The disparities impact statement will provide the contextual and measurement framework for ongoing monitoring and determining the impact of the project activities on outcomes and the overarching goal of advancing health equity. Next slide, please. So we included this logic model to give you a contextual and actual visual of what we mean about this project. So the logic model lays out the expected activities, outcomes, and impact that are detailed in the NOFO. The activities for demonstrating effective policies begins with policy identification, found in column 1, in collaboration with a multi-sector advisory council. Next, the policy assessment, using the OMH-funded policy assessment framework and tool. 3, the policy demonstration of 1 to 3 high impact policies based on the results of the assessment in 3 discrete settings, such as schools, youth recreation, faith-based. Next, the policy evaluation of those 3 demonstrations. And then last, the policy dissemination of the results in briefs, reports, and fact sheets. These activities and expectations lead to the outputs, which can be seen in the second column. The cross-sector collaboration and decision-making, which are the general policies reviewed and prioritized. Next, the broad range of policies analyzed and implemented, which will show effective policy approaches implemented and replicated across systems. And the last is the rigorous evaluation and dissemination, where policy data is collected and mental health impact assessed and documented. The next column are the outcomes. And the outcomes include expansion of high impact policy approaches and increased knowledge and unintended consequences of general policies. And then last will be the impact, which will show improved policies that promote Black youth mental health. Next slide, please. This, by the way, this logic model that we have displayed here will be available as a resource in grants.gov along with the other NOFO documents. So now we will talk about successful applicants and what the application content include. And this information can be found on pages 16 through 20 of the NOFO. The project narrative is the most important part of the application, since it will be used as the primary basis to determine whether your project meets the minimum requirements for an award under this announcement. The project narrative should provide a clear and concise description of your project. HHS recommends that your project narrative include the following components: the statement of need, the organizational capacity, the project plan, which includes goals, objectives, and outcomes, policy intervention, as well as the work plan. Next, it should include the evaluation plan, the dissemination plan, the sustainability plan, as well as a budget. Next slide, please. You can find information about the application appendices on pages 27 through 28 in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Appendices will count toward the total page limit of your application. You must submit them as a single electronic file uploaded to the attachments section of your grants.gov application. With the project narrative, applicants should also take note of appendices to submit as an attachment. And please refer to the NOFO for the full description of each of the appendix items. Here, the supplemental information supporting documentation for the work plan. You may use the optional objective work plan template, which is provided in the application material, or you may create your own work plan. Regardless of the option you choose for your work plan, you must submit and address all of the content requested. Your work plan should reflect and be consistent with the project narrative and budget narrative and must cover all years of the period of performance. However, each year's activities should be fully attainable in one budget year. You may propose multi-year activities as well as activities that build upon each other, but each phase of the project must be discrete and attainable within a single budget year. Your work plan should include a statement of the project's overall goal, anticipated outcomes, key objectives, and the major tasks, action steps, or products that will be pursued or developed to achieve the goal and outcomes. For each major task of each year, action step, or product, your work plan should identify the timeframes involved, including start and end dates, and the lead person responsible for completing that task. The population of focus. You must submit a table outlining the population of focus for the proposed project, desegregating by race and ethnicity within the identified geographic area of focus using quantitative data. Next, you need to submit the memorandum of agreement and/or letters of commitment from partners, subrecipient organizations, and agencies. You should include a signed memorandum of agreement for all organizations and entities that have been specifically named as a recipient or partner to carry out any aspect of the project. The signed MOA must clearly detail the specific role and resources, including in-kind, that each entity will bring to the project, state the duration and terms of the agreement, cover the entire project period, and be signed by an authorized representative. The organization's expertise, experience, and access to the target population should be described in the MOA. Letters of commitment may be submitted if an MOA has not been fully executed at the time of submission. A letter of commitment signed from an anticipated subrecipient or partner must detail the specific role and resources that will be provided or activities that will be undertaken in support of the applicant. The organization's expertise, experience, and access to the target population should also be described in the letter of commitment. Submission of a fully executed MOA may be required as a special condition of any award made under this announcement. The MOAs are not the same as letters of support. Letters of support are letters that are general in nature, that speak to the writer's belief in the capability of an applicant to accomplish a goal or task. And the letters of support also may indicate an intent or interest to work together in the future, but they lack specificity. You should not provide letters of support, and letters of support such as this will not be considered during the review. The organizational chart you should include an organizational chart that reflects the management structure for the project and demonstrates where the project resides within the greater organization. In addition, your chart must include the names of partners and role and responsibility and level of commitment to this project. Next, curriculum vitae or resume for key project personnel and position descriptions. You must submit with your application curriculum vitae, and resumes of the project director, principal investigator, and all other key personnel. Key personnel include those individuals who will oversee the technical, professional, managerial, and support functions and/or assume responsibility for assuring the validity and quality of your organization's program. This includes, at a minimum, the program manager or program coordinator, and we encourage individuals to use their full first, middle, and last on these documents to distinguish them from verification in the system of award management exclusion records. Omission of a middle name or initial may delay the award of an approved application. You should use the formatting common to those documents, and you can see that at the grants.nih.gov site for the templates or sample bio sketches if you need those. You must also submit position descriptions for all open positions that will need to be filled if funds are awarded. And then last, the logic model. You must submit a logic model that specifies and describes the program theory to be employed in the policy intervention. All program objectives, activities, outputs, and outcomes must be reflected in the local model and demonstrate that the proposed project reflects a coherent approach. Next slide, please. So the application review criteria can be found on pages 34 through 37 in the NOFO. Federal staff and independent review panel will assess all eligible applications according to the following criteria. Disqualified applications will not be reviewed against these criteria. I will briefly run through some key points for each of these, but they can be found again in detail in pages 34 through 37 of the NOFO. The statement of need, which describes in detail the scope of the problem and contributing factors that demonstrate need in the proposed project, will be worth 10 points. You will also, in this section, provide relevant quantitative data. You will provide strong description and relevant data for the current policy context that includes challenges, gaps, and opportunities for addressing Black youth mental health. You will comprehensively describe the population of focus, including the demographic characteristics, race and ethnicity, documented health disparities, and the geographic area using recent, local, and disaggregated data wherever possible. The organizational capacity is worth 15 points, and it should describe or demonstrate the organization's ability, capability, and readiness to successfully implement the proposed project, including managing advisory councils, collaborating with minority serving institutions, and working with community organizations. It should describe current or previous relevant experience, as well as capability and capacity in working with the population of focus. It should demonstrate the organization's experience implementing similar projects in a culturally and linguistically appropriate manner. It should also demonstrate relevant, appropriate experience and educational background for proposed positions on the project as supported by, excuse me, the curriculum vitae or bio sketches for key personnel. Areas of expertise for key personnel, including the principal investigator, the project director, and evaluator, including identification of that individual organization responsible for evaluation activities with a description of that individual and organization's qualification. Under the project plan, again, you have three components. The goals, objectives, and outcomes section is worth 10 points, and it should clearly project goals and objectives, describe objectives that are SMART, specific, measurable, accurate, realistic, and time-bound. It should also include measurable outcomes that will result from the project and provide specific quantified estimate of expected outcomes. The policy intervention, which is also worth 10 points, should describe a comprehensive approach to the identification of the policy options, assessment of policies, selection of high impact policies, and dissemination of results from policy assessments. It should also describe appropriate rationale for the expected policy intervention participants and the approach for recruiting, enrolling, engaging, and retaining them in the project. It should also describe the specific practices to be used in the policy intervention in relation to the project or the problem and the factors to be addressed by the project. The work plan. Oh, excuse me, sorry, one more point for the policy intervention. It should also describe the policy intervention will be carried out, by whom the project intervention, the policy intervention will be carried out, and the roles of any collaborating organizations, partners, or subrecipients. It should clearly identify any major internal and external barriers anticipated and how the project will be able to overcome those barriers. The work plan, which is worth 15 points, should describe an appropriate and feasible proposed approach and activities. It should include well-reasoned and appropriate strategies, methodology, and activities to accomplish the specific goal or goals and objectives of the project and to produce measurable outcomes. It should describe major tasks and actions, steps, and frameworks to achieve the goal and the outcomes. A feasible approach for monitoring and tracking progress on the project's tasks and objectives is expected. A use of appropriate data sets to provide baseline data supporting the identification of populations of focus and related health disparities. Strategies that address the identified health disparities, application of the national class standards, and an ongoing quality improvement process to address the identified disparities. An applicant's work plan should also describe the projected impact of the project on the target population and on the identified health disparities and level of impact expected. The evaluation plan, worth 20 points. The application will be assessed based on how well the applicant describes a clear plan for evaluating the organization's performance and a process of continuous quality improvement. It should also describe appropriate process and outcome evaluation techniques to analyze the goals and objectives of the proposed project. It should discuss in detail the process to evaluate all project components of the project's logic model. It should include a comprehensive and appropriate logic model to achieve the designed outcomes and that demonstrates linkages between the objectives, the activities, and the outcomes. Excuse me. It should describe the approach for developing measures that demonstrate the effectiveness of policy assessments. It should describe a feasible evaluation approach for determining whether the project reached its population of focus. It should have a feasible and rigorous evaluation approach for effectively demonstrating the equity impact of the project on the disparate racial and ethnic minority population and on the identified health disparities. The dissemination plan is worth 10 points, and it should describe the appropriate and feasible approach for documenting and disseminating the project knowledge and the findings to relevant stakeholders. It should demonstrate the project's results and findings will be disseminated in an easily understandable format to the target audience, the general public, and other parties who might be interested. The preliminary sustainability plan, worth 5 points, should also be included in your application, and it should describe a feasible approach for developing a preliminary sustainability plan that includes feasible strategies to sustain the project beyond the project period. And last, the budget, which will be 5 points. To the extent of which applicants can demonstrate that the budget and the budget narrative show how the total amount requested was determined and is detailed, reasonable, adequate, cost efficient, and aligned with the proposed technical approach. Next slide, please. So the NOFO appendices, the work plan, the table population of focus, the memorandum of agreement and letters of commitment, organizational chart, the CVs or resumes of key staff, and the logic model are all appendices of the NOFO, including the definitions and the disparities impact statement resources can be found in the NOFO. Next slide. So this is a list of evaluation planning resources which you will have access to through the NOFO, as well as supporting documents that will be uploaded. And now I will turn it over to Dwayne Barlow from the Grants and Acquisitions Management Office.
Thanks, Tish. This is Scott Moore. I'm stepping in for Dwayne at the last minutes. And GAM, we've been very popular this week, so we've moved from between a lot of meetings today. But good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Moore. I'm the Director for Grants and Acquisitions Management in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. My office provides support to all of the OASH offices and OMH. In all phases of grants management, from the development of the NOFOs that we're talking about, like the one today, all the way through the award making process. And should you be successful, if you apply for the award and you obtain an award, you will be working closely with us all the way through the closeout of the award, which is usually several months after the actual project ends. So we're involved in every step in every phase of the process. My team and I are responsible for all aspects of management of the grant making endeavor in OASH. Next slide, please. One of the most important things to remember as we manage through this process are the submission dates and times. Your application, should you decide to apply for this opportunity, is due by 6:00 p.m. Eastern Time, June 22nd, 2022. That is 6:00 p.m. Eastern. It is a hard stop. Your application will be disqualified if we receive it at 6:01 or later. We occasionally do have to have that disqualification, and it is not the most pleasant part of our job to do that. So please plan ahead, and please try to get your application in well before 6 p.m. on the due date. Now, your submission time will be determined by the date and timestamp provided by grants.gov when you complete your submission. We strongly encourage you to submit your application a minimum of 3 to 5 days prior to the application closing date. Grants.gov is not a system that I own. It is a system that we are required to use. It is under separate management. And it is a heavily used system, not just by OASH, but all of HHS, Health and Human Services, and the bulk of the federal government. So there are a lot of applications coming in every day. So as you might expect, occasionally, it's not that often, but occasionally there may be a glitch. So you want to be ahead of the game. Now, grants.gov also may take up to 48 hours to notify you of a successful submission. So you may submit your application, but it may be up to 48 hours before you get that email confirming that the submission was successful with your timestamp So the sooner you start, the sooner you have a chance to go back and try to fix something if something does go wrong. Now, please note that if you fail to submit your application by the due date and time, we will not review that application and it will receive no further consideration. And again, the application is due 6 p.m. Eastern Time, June 22nd, 2022. Next slide, please. To be eligible for an award under this competition, you must be a public or private nonprofit entity located in a state. And for our purposes, a state includes the 50 United States, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, Guam, Republic of Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. If you are a public or private nonprofit entity in these locations, you are eligible to apply for an award under this announcement. Please note, faith-based organizations, as well as American Indian, Alaska Native, Native American organizations that are public or nonprofit private entities are also eligible to apply. Furthermore, community-based organizations that are public or nonprofit private entities are also eligible to apply. Basically, to summarize this entire slide, if you are a for-profit institution, you are not eligible to apply. If you have any questions about specific eligibility, you may contact one of the points of contact in the notice of funding opportunity, and we can provide some additional clarification. But next slide. We do have a sample list of eligible applicants, and these include state governments, county governments, city or township governments, special district governments, independent school districts, public and state-controlled institutions of higher education, Native American tribal governments, both federally recognized and other than federally recognized tribal governments, public housing authorities and Indian housing authorities, nonprofits, both having 501c3 status or not having 501c3 status with the IRS, private nonprofit institutions of higher education, and the US territories. And please note that prior to making any award, we may request documentation of your nonprofit status if it is not clear from the databases that we're checking to confirm that status. Next slide, please. For this particular announcement, you are not required to provide cost sharing or matching in your proposed budget. However, if you voluntarily include cost sharing in your application, including in-kind contributions, you must include in your budget narrative a non-federal sources justification. Now, during the merit review of an application, cost sharing will only be considered in the overall review of the adequacy of the total proposed budget, which is the federal and non-federal share combined, and its ability to support the project proposed. Applications including voluntary cost sharing or matching that result in an award will include on the notice of award the cost sharing or matching commitment at the level that was proposed in the application. Any change in that commitment level will require prior approval of the grants management officer during the course of the award. But once it is on the notice of award, however it appears on the notice of award, that is an obligation that you are expected to meet. Next slide, please. So the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFO, as we refer to it, provides information and guidance related to the application and the processes for reviewing it. Please read the entire funding announcement in its entirety. I understand it's long, but it contains a lot of useful information that will save you a headache later on. Please follow the NOFO very carefully and ask questions if you should have any during the process. The information provided in the NOFO takes precedence over any conflicting information that may appear in other documents, in these slides, or in anything that Tish and I have said during the course of this webinar. It is the document that governs the entire process. We highly recommend subscribing to the announcement in grants.gov. There is a button that says subscribe up in the upper right-hand corner. We highly recommend registering for that so that in the event that we need to update the NOFO during the course of the application period, and it does occasionally happen, You are immediately notified of that update, and we will identify the update for you, as well as provide the updated notice of funding opportunity. Next slide, please. To request an application package, our application packages are located on grants.gov, and you may access those electronically at www.grants.gov. You can find it by searching the assistance listing, which is we used to be called the CFDA number, found on page 2 of the NOFO. Now, the assistance listing in particular for this one, should you not have the NOFO in hand at the moment, is 93.137. And that will take you to the list of current opportunities open through the Office of Minority Health. This particular NOFO, its number is MP-CPI-22-001. Again, please be sure to subscribe to the announcement in grants.gov so you receive notification of any updates to the NOFO or any of the supporting documents that go with it. Next slide, please. Now, OASH requires that all applications be submitted electronically via grants.gov unless an exemption has been granted by me, the Grants Management Officer, as described in section F5 of the NOFO. If you submit an application via any other electronic mechanism communication, it will not be accepted for review. Please, please do not email your application to us. If it does not come in through grants.gov, it is not submitted properly, unless you have arranged beforehand and have written approval from me. Grants.gov is a website portal. As I mentioned, it is not a website that we own or maintain. It is one that we use, and all of our funding opportunities and grant application packages are made available on this site. An application will not be considered valid until all the application components are entered in grants.gov and received by OASH Grants and Acquisitions Management Division according to the deadlines specified in the dates section of the NOFO. And that would be 6 p.m. on June 22nd, 2022, 6 p.m. Eastern. Should you have any technical issues, concerns, or questions related to the use of the grants.gov system, please direct those questions to grants.gov. We've included their phone number here. They also have a help link on their website. They are immensely helpful. They keep their materials on the website very much up to date. They are great partners to us, and they should be able to solve your problem, particularly with the submission through that system, a lot faster than we can. Though if you do call them or if you do submit a ticket to them, please keep track of that ticket number, and should we have to backtrack anything on your behalf at any point, we will need that ticket number to assess the situation. Next slide, please. So applications must be submitted as 3 files. The first file is going to be your entire project narrative, and that's described in section F3A. Your second file is going to be the composite of your entire budget narrative, including the supporting documentation describing the budget narrative as described in the budget narrative content section in the NOFO, which is section F3B. And your third file is going to be all of your appendices combined into a single file, and those will be uploaded as the attachment section of your grants.gov application. Now, this is described in section F3C. Please note that, well, before we get to the standard forms, for this particular announcement for OMH, we are offering an optional work plan template that is a PDF. It is a standard government form. We left the instruction pages attached to it. Those instruction pages will not be counted toward your overall page count for your application. So it is only the substantive content. One approach to handling that is going to be to print, after you fill in that PDF file, is to print just those pages that have the content for your work plan into a new PDF, and then you can combine that with your other documents to make up your third file, your attachments file for your application. Now, please note that the required standard forms in your application, and we'll talk about those in a moment, do not apply toward your page count limitations in the submission requirements as stated in the disqualification criteria. And those standard forms will tend to start with the letters SF for standard form in government speak, and we will talk about those shortly. Next slide, please. As I was starting to allude to, any files uploaded or attached to your grants.gov application must be one of the following file formats. You must use either Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Adobe PDF, or an image format that is limited to JPEG, GIF, TIFF, or bitmap. Please note, Microsoft Excel files will not be accepted. I know that is maybe different than some of the other places that you have applied to, but we do not accept Microsoft Excel files. There are too many challenges with converting those files into the reviewer system for our reviewers to review. So please, if you're preparing your files or preparing your application with tables or Excel files, please print those to an Adobe PDF, export them to Microsoft Word, or any of the acceptable file formats for us. Now in OASH, we strongly recommend that your electronic application be uploaded as Adobe PDF files. Ultimately, it is an Adobe PDF that will go to our reviewers for review. So if you converted to a PDF as part of your submission, you may prevent any unintentional formatting that might occur with the submission of an editable document. It also, by converting it to a PDF, before you submit it, lets you check the page count of your PDF, and or you can just print the file to ensure that you haven't exceeded the page limit, and it gives you a nice copy to keep on hand for your own records. Next slide, please. In your application, please be complete. Do not leave blanks on any of the forms unless the information is clearly not applicable to you. And please, the individual who is going to be submitting and certifying the application and the forms must actually have the legal authority to do so and to act on behalf of your organization. I have experienced throughout my career a couple of instances where a very eager PI or PD decided on their own to submit an application without consulting with their organizational representative, submitted it, got a very good review, but when it came time to make the award, the organization said, wait a minute, we didn't know anything about this and we can't accept it. So please, if you're submitting on behalf of your organization, please make sure that you have the legal authority to do so. Next slide, please. To ensure a successful submission of your application, carefully follow the step-by-step instructions provided on the grants.gov website. We've provided the link here. The instructions are kept up to date, as I mentioned, and have some very useful frequently asked question documents, or FAQs, and other troubleshooting information on the website. Again, the grants.gov website is an amazing resource for grants in general, and their help desk is immensely helpful. Next slide, please. So the application elements, I had mentioned there were standard forms. So there are forms, and all of these forms are laid out for you and part of the application package that's available on grants.gov. The first is the SF424, the application for federal assistance. The SF424A, budget information for non-construction programs. SF424B, it is the assurances for non-construction programs. There is a lobbying activities disclosure form, the SF-LLL, and a project abstract summary. Now note that the project abstract summary, the contents of that form, should you get an award, will be published publicly on usaspending.gov, as well as the HHS tags system. We do not edit those, we do not rewrite those, so whatever you submit in that abstract form is what will be published, so please, no proprietary information. Those constitute your forms, the 5 forms. And again, I mentioned the 3 files: your project narrative submitted as a single acceptable file, your budget narrative submitted as a single acceptable file, and your appendices. So all of your appendices combined into a single acceptable file in the attachment section of your grants.gov application. Next slide, please. This is just reiterating what I said about the project abstract summary. If you receive an award under this announcement, the abstract summary will be published. And again, do not include any proprietary or confidential information in your project abstract summary. Next slide, please. As far as the actual format of your application, be sure to follow the project narrative format instructions in the notice of funding opportunity. Your application will be disqualified if it does not conform to the format requirements. These include: you must double space the project narrative pages. You must use a 12-point font. You should use an easily readable typeface, such as Times New Roman or Arial. You should be seeing a theme in these formatting instructions. We want your application to be easily readable by the reviewers. You do not want to make them have to work too hard to read something that's difficult to see or read. You may single space tables or use alternate formats, but you must ensure that the tables are easy to read. The same formatting instructions apply for both your appendices and your budget narrative, with one caveat. Appendix documents such as resumes, curriculum vitae, bio sketches may use alternate formats that are common to such documents. But again, please ensure that they are easy to read. Next slide, please. So as of April 4th this year, we, the federal government, have completed our transition from using the 9-digit DUNS number as the official unique entity identifier for organizations to the 12-digit UEI, and this is a UEI generated in SAM number. Now this transition basically eliminates one step in the registration process, where institutions, particularly first-time applicants, would need to go register in the Dun & Bradstreet system to get the DUNS number, and then come into SAM and register in the System for Award Management, also known as SAM. And the reason that this would happen is we need a unique entity identifier now generated within SAM itself, which is required for submission of all applications. You can find a plethora of information about this transition and information just about the UEI in SAM at the link provided here. The link is also provided in the NOFO. But a SAM registration is required, an active SAM registration is required before your application will be submitted through or will be accepted through the system. Next slide, please. And speaking of that, you must register online in SAM at sam.gov. You are advised to begin the process immediately. It can take some time for registration to become active. We do not want you to have to scramble at the very end, coming up to the deadline for application submission to try to get this registration complete. So if you are selected for award, you must have an active registration before receiving the award. And for those of you who have been federal awardees in the past, your SAM registration must be up to date and current. So if it is expired, you're not registered. You need to make sure that you keep up with that. You need to make sure that your SAM registration information is accurate, especially your organization's legal name, and the physical address, including zip +4. This minimizes errors farther down the road. If we're missing the 4-digit tag on your zip code, you can look that up by just inputting your address into the US Postal Service website. They have a way to put in your address, and it will generate the 4 digits on the end of your zip if you're not sure what those are. Note that should you successfully compete and receive an award, the information as it appears in SAM, particularly your organization name, organization's legal name, and physical address, will be included on the notice of award. We will not change that name. So your unique entity identifier, as you are registered in SAM, is going to carry through and populate on the notice of award. So it's, you have to use the legal name. And that's what we're going to work with from our side. Now, for instructions on updating the SAM registration information, we've provided the link here. Again, the site is sam.gov. Next slide, please. If you are registering as a new entity in sam.gov, so this is the first time you've registered in there, please note you're going to need to create a login.gov account if you don't already have one. And you might as well, because if you receive an award with us, you're going to need that login.gov account to access the grant management system. Please note that the complete process for registering a new entity involves submission of a notarized letter. You have to get the notarized letter. They will accept a scan of it, but you still need to go through the step of submitting, getting the notarized letter. As far as sitting down and completing the online registration in SAM, that part takes about 30 minutes, but it can take, after they have received all of your other documentation, it can take up to 10 days or longer, depending on volume, for your registration to become active. So start back calculating out from the application deadline. 10 days may be too close to call. We really suggest if you need to register a new organization or update your registration in SAM, you start working on it now. Now, the average time frame once you are officially registered in SAM for that to sync up with grants.gov, it can take up to 72 hours. They are separate systems. They have to sync up. So it can take a little bit of time. Next slide, please. Mentioned this several times, and the reason I mentioned it several times is some folks forget to do it or just don't believe us. But SAM registration must be renewed each year. An active SAM registration may be required prior to receiving a new or a continuation award. I have had to hold awards back simply because SAM registrations were not active. And if we get to the end of a fiscal year, not having a SAM registration is a justification and a reason for us to skip you if you are recommended for an award and move on to a different awardee or a different recommended awardee. So if you are renewing your SAM registration, your old sam.gov username and password may not work anymore. You will need to create a login.gov account if you do not already have one. And again, please consult the information, particularly if you're renewing an old registration. Please check out the information on sam.gov regarding the transition of existing registrations from DUNS to UEI. So if you're already in the system, you may have already had a UEI for SAM created automatically for you. Next slide, please. We strongly recommend that you check for your active registration before the application deadline. If I'm sounding like a broken record, there is a reason for that. If you are successful in receiving an award, you must maintain an active SAM registration with current information at all times during the active award. If you have not complied with the registration, we may determine you are not qualified to receive an award, and we may use that determination as a basis for making an award to another applicant. Also, if you're going to be using subrecipients, your subaward recipients must also have a DUNS UEI, must also have a UEI number at the time you, the recipient, make a subaward. They will need to be registered in SAM as well. not at the application phase, but before you make your subaward to them, they would need to be registered. Next slide, please. Funding restrictions. If you're successful and you receive an award, by accepting the award, you agree that the award and any activities thereunder are subject to all provisions of 45 CFR Part 75 currently in effect or implemented during the period of the award. Any other departmental regulations and policies in effect at the time of the award, and the applicable statutory provisions. For costs to be allocated to, or to be allowable under the award, well, let's start that again. Costs must be allowable, allocable, reasonable, and necessary direct expenses or indirect costs in accordance with the regulations and current policy. Indirect costs may be included per 45 CFR 75-414. Applicants should indicate which method or rate is being used for the application. This is described in section F3B10. If you search indirect costs, there is a heading for it in the NOFO. Also, pre-award costs are not allowed. This is explained in section F7A. And there's a current salary limitation. This was effective in January of this year. It is based on the executive level 2 salary, federal salary. So $203,700 per year. There's a table showing you how to prorate that out based on somebody's full-time FTE percentage that's being allocated to the project. But it is prorated. It is not just an absolute value. Next slide, please. Okay. When it comes to the project, to the budget narrative and the forms, there are really 3 documents that really make up the budget. And that is SF424A, the budget form, the budget narrative, and your detailed budget justification. And the narrative and the justification often merge together. Please, you must be consistent with the requirements of the NOFO. Budgeted costs must reflect the proposed activities. Budget line item descriptions and justification requirements are explained in the NOFO in substantial detail. In fact, that's the bulk of the text in the NOFO. We have provided suggested table formats. And also, please don't overlook section F3B2, which is your need to submit a plan for oversight of federal award funds. There are supplementary materials included in the NOFO, giving you an idea of the types of questions that that plan should address. Now, when it comes to page limits and the application, please note that the forms, the budget narrative, and the detailed budget justification do not count toward your page limit. There is no page limit there because we really do need to see and assess the reasonableness of the budget for carrying out the proposed activities. So those pages will not count toward your page limit. Next slide, please. So speaking of page limits, your application, if it doesn't meet the following requirements, will be disqualified and receive no further consideration. And this is all listed in one specific section of the NOFO, but you must submit electronically via grants.gov by the due date and time, unless an exemption was granted 2 business days prior to the deadline. Otherwise, you will be disqualified. If you successfully submit multiple applications for the same project, so somebody uploads a draft too early and you need to upload a second draft or a second application in there, we will only review the last application received by the deadline. So there's no submit a placeholder and then come back with the final document after the deadline. We will go with the one that meets the deadline. We will go the one closest to that deadline that is not past the deadline. It is my office and my staff that will deem whether or not your application is eligible. We will review those criteria for eligibility. You must include the completed forms for the application, which are going to be SF424, SF424A, SF424B, SFLLL, and the project abstract summary. If those 5 forms are missing, you will not proceed to the merit review process. Your application must be submitted in the English language and must be in terms of US dollars. This is required by regulation 45 CFR 75-111A. Next slide, please. Your project narrative must be double spaced on the equivalent of 8.5 by 11 page size with 1-inch margins on all sides and a font not less than 12 points. Back in the day when we did paper applications, we literally had staff who were there measuring with a ruler. It's a little bit easier for us to assess it with the electronic applications. And we really do monitor to see if it's 8.5 by 11, A4 is not going to work. Project narrative, your project narrative must not exceed 40 pages. Your total application, which is your project narrative and your appendices, must not exceed 80 pages. The standard forms and the 3 instruction pages on the optional work plan template do not count toward the overall page limit. Next slide, please. So your request for federal funds, including indirect costs, may not exceed the maximum indicated award ceiling in Section D of the NOFO. Your federal funds request, including indirect costs, must not fall below the listed floor. If you have included voluntary cost sharing or matching, you must include in your budget narrative a non-federal sources justification, or you will be disqualified. You must have that justification if you have included voluntary cost sharing. And your application must meet any application responsiveness criteria that are listed under Section E3, titled Other Application Responsiveness Criteria. Next slide, please. And for this particular application, I am verifying now, there are no other application responsiveness criteria to worry about. So that last disqualification option is going to be really easy for you guys. So applications that lack any required supporting documentation, for instance, a CV, the work plan, the population of focus documents, or if you decide to submit additional appendix files on your own, your application will not be disqualified from competitive review. However, please note that this may impact your application scoring under the evaluation criteria, particularly if documentation is missing. Do not attempt to supplement your project narrative by submitting extra appendix files. Those files will be removed. Be sure, of course, to follow all of the submission instructions carefully. Next slide, please. The application review criteria, particularly the scoring, the weighting of the different sections, are outlined here and outlined in far more detail in Section G1 of the NOFO. But your statement of need is going to be weighted 10 points, organizational capacity 15 points, your project plan, the goals, objectives, and outcomes at 10 points, your policy intervention at 10, your work plan at 15, your evaluation plan at 20, your dissemination plan 10 points, the preliminary sustainability plan 5, and your budget 5 points. These are all explained in much more detail. And in fact, the text that you see in the NOFO will be provided to the reviewers as their guidance and instructions for how to review and weight the proposals, the different sections. Next slide, please. Eligible applications will be reviewed and assessed by a panel of independent reviewers with non-technical expertise in the applicable fields according to the criteria listed in the NOFO. The merit review process is formal and confidential. Federal staff will be available to answer questions for the panel and to ensure that the process is consistent and fair, but federal staff will not and do not participate in the discussion and the assessment and scoring of the application. It is only after the merit review panel has completed the scoring and assessment of the applications that the applications are then reviewed by my staff for administrative and business compliance and by the OMH program office staff for programmatic compliance. Next slide, please. Now it will be the director of the Office of Minority Health will make final award selections that will be recommended to me as the grants management officer for risk analysis. And it is important to note that these are recommendations and not final award decisions at this point. In making those recommendations, the director of the Office of Minority Health will take into consideration the following additional factor, and that is the distribution of awards across the focus populations. Upon completion of risk analysis and concurrence by the grants management officer, it is OASH that will then issue notices of award to the selected awardees. Note, no award decision is final until the notice of award is issued, and by issued, we mean signed by the grants management officer. All award decisions, including the level of funding, if an award is made, are final at that point, and you may not appeal the decision. Next slide, please. We are not obligated to make any federal award as a result of this announcement. Only the grants management officer can bind the federal government to the expenditure of funds. If at any point during the application process or the review process you receive communications to negotiate an award or a request for additional or clarifying information, this does not mean you are going to receive an award. It only means that your application is still under consideration. All award decisions, including the level of funding if an award is made, are final and not appealable. Next slide, please. Now, in the risk analysis that I mentioned, it is my staff that will evaluate each application in the fundable range that's been recommended to us for risks posed by you, the applicants, before we can issue the award. And this is required of us by 45 CFR 75-205. The approach that we use is consistent with that in the regulation. We will look at your financial stability. If you are recommended for an award, we will look at your financial stability. We will assess the quality of your management systems and the ability to meet the management standards prescribed by the regulation. We will also look at your history of performance as an awardee. We'll look at your record in managing a federal award. This includes timeliness and compliance with the applicable reporting requirements and conformance to the terms and conditions of previous federal awards. Just a tip, if you're a previous federal awardee or a current federal awardee, if you have overdue federal financial reports, overdue closeout documentation for existing awards, if you are recommended for an award, you may be either skipped, you may not receive an award, your award may come with special conditions, or your award may be delayed until you remedy the overdue reporting. We do assess reports and findings from audits performed, particularly the single audits, and your ability to effectively implement statutory, regulatory, or other requirements that would be imposed on non-federal entities. So we are looking at the financial and managerial risks to the award or the possible award. Next slide, please. Now, if your internal controls are available online, you may provide a link to them as part of your plan in the budget narrative, your plan for oversight of federal awards. If you don't and you're recommended for an award, we are going to ask for your internal controls as part of the risk assessment. So if the link is there and you are recommended, that just speeds up the process on our side. We've also included in the supplementary material of the NOFO questions applicants find useful in considering their plan for oversight of federal awards. So next slide, please. Now, if as a result of the risk analysis, we determine that your organization does not meet the minimum qualification standards as described by the regulation, and we determine that we cannot make an award to you as a result, we will report that determination to FAPIS, which is the federal, it's the integrity and performance system that we use. And this data becomes available to all federal agencies in the course of doing their risk analysis for awards. So that information in FAPIS may be used as part of the risk assessment for others. So we want to make sure that you have a good report in FAPIS. It is something that we check along the way as well. Next slide, please. So once we go through the review process and we've successfully completed risk assessment and we have our slate of recommended awards that we have concurred with on the grants management side, we will prepare a document called the Notice of Award, or the NOAA. Now, the Notice of Award notifies you as a successful applicant of your selection, the award amount, the project, and the budget periods. It's also going to include any standard terms, reporting requirements, and contact information for both my office and the Office of Minority Health. And it will include any conditions on the award, such as requirements that must be met as a condition of receiving the grant funds. Next slide, please. As my office is the official point of contact for all awardees throughout the award lifecycle, as well as through the application process, all official communication related to the award is going to be between GAM, Grants and Acquisition Management, and the successful applicant. Now, if you were unsuccessful in this particular competition, you will receive notification by the program from the program office via letter. Next slide, please. Just a quick summary and tips for this particular competition. In your project narrative, be clear, complete, and concise in the project description. Follow and address exactly what the program is requesting in the NOFO. Do not make the reviewer search for the required information. Generally, the easier the application is to review, the better the rating or score is going to be. Please note, reviewers are not allowed to do external research, follow embedded links, etc. Particularly those embedded links. It's no fair using those because that's artificially expanding past the page limits. So no embedded links, please. They won't be able to follow them. Clearly identify the sections of the application and indicate which component is being addressed. The project narrative must include all required information within the page limit. Do not use appendices either to expand the page limit. Next slide, please. Make sure that your goals and objectives are SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timeframed, if that is required in the NOFO. The activities you present in the work plan should relate directly to the proposed goals and objectives. The program work plan, evaluation plan, or any other planning documents that are requested, plus the budget, should provide a complete picture of how you address the needs, as well as address the purposes and expectations described in the NOFO. Next slide. Staffing. When describing your staffing should be appropriate and reasonable to the goals, objectives, and activities of the proposed project. Be complete in describing what staff will do, the expertise that's required, and the percentage of time that they will be assigned to the project. Next slide. Budget. Your budget should include adequate funds to carry out the proposed work plan, the evaluation plan, and the administrative responsibilities of the project. Your budget should be reasonable and relate directly to the goals and objectives. Do not request more funds than are available as listed in the NOFO. That amount, that ceiling, is inclusive of indirect costs. The operating budget should be complete and include federal and non-federal funds, projected program income. Program income are fees from third-party payers and other contributing funds. Program income is unlikely in this particular opportunity. It comes up in more often in conference grants and services grants. Next slide, please. Overall, please include the full names, first, middle, and last, of your authorized official, your principal investigator, project director, and all essential key personnel. If you go by your initials, I know some folks don't like the name that they were given, but please give us your full legal name. It does speed the process. If we are unable to verify whether or not you are in the exclusion database based on the information you give us, we will contact you prior to making any award. Or if we are not able to confirm the information, again, we can use that as a justification to not make the award to you and move on to somebody else on the list. Electronic submission is required. Do not wait until the last minute to begin SAM registration or update your registration. And please don't wait until the last minute to begin the electronic submission through grants.gov. Problems could arise. And there really is nothing that I can do about it if you wait until too late. Next slide, please. These are the relevant points of contact for the Office of Minority Health. Is Paul Rodriguez. Our emails are very, very easy. First dot last name at hhs.gov. On the administrative side, it's going to be Dwayne Barlow, our branch chief for grants, Dwayne.Barlow at hhs.gov. Just again, a reminder, anything that relates to electronic submission requirements, grants.gov applicant support is really the best contact for them, either through the website, through their email at support@grants.gov, or through their 800 number. Please don't contact us, particularly if we're getting close to submission deadlines. You want to go right to the source, which is grants.gov, to resolve any of those technical issues. And please get a ticket number when you do so in case we need to backtrack the issue. With that, next slide, please. I think we are on to questions. So I will turn it back over to Tish and the OMH team.
Thank you, Scott. This is Yannick Edmond. At this time, we will address the questions submitted in the Q&A. If we are unable to answer all the questions, please be reminded that we will post an FAQ to grants.gov. And so the first question is for Scott. And Scott, the first question is regarding the deadline. What is the deadline for submitting an application in response to this funding opportunity?
Okay. The deadline is June 22nd, 2022 at 6 p.m., 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. If it's 6:01, you are late and you will be disqualified.
Thank you, Scott. The next question is also for you, Scott. Are for-profit organizations eligible to participate in this funding opportunity?
Unfortunately, for-profit organizations are not eligible. This derives from the OMH authorizing statute, and unfortunately, they are not allowed to fund for-profit organizations.
Thank you, Scott. The next question is for Tish. Tish, the question is, what do you mean by 3 separate settings?
Great question. So when we talk about the 3 separate settings, it can refer to page 10 of the NOFO, but we expect recipients to identify 3 different discrete settings or systems where Black youth and their families are engaged and or live. So for example, you may include 1 school setting, 1 youth development setting, recreation setting, sports setting, and a faith-based setting.
Thank you, Tish. Another question is again regarding the settings. Is the expectation for the same policy to be implemented in all 3 settings instead of 1 setting per 1 policy?
So using the results from your policy assessment and evidence-based selection process, we expect recipients to select from 1 to 3 policies for implementation in 3 discrete settings. This may include one policy across the 3 settings or 3 different policies based upon which the policy is most appropriate for implementation and demonstration in one of the settings, either because of what the policy covers or is based on the community context. But again, that information is included in the NOFO on page 10.
Thank you, Tish. And the final question is, what is the population of focus for this initiative?
Also, another great question. So the population of focus for this initiative is Black youth ages 10 to 17 who are African American or from the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world with African ancestry who are living within the United States.
Thank you, Tish. And again, thank you everyone for joining us for this Notice of Funding Opportunity Technical Assistance webinar. Next slide. The slides for today's webinar will be posted on grants.gov following the presentation. The webinar recording will be posted to OMH's YouTube channel. In addition, we strongly recommend that you subscribe to this NOFO. Please go to www.grants.gov and click the Search Grants tab in the upper left corner. And using the information that was provided, enter the MP-CPI-22-001 opportunity number to search for and find this particular NOFO. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. It will be posted on grants.gov and the webinar recording will be available on OMH's YouTube channel. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your interest in this funding opportunity and best of luck in the application process.